Hello, everybody out there in the podcast world. This is your neighborhood sommelier, Dustin, taking you on a journey through the wine world. Tonight, I come to you from South Carolina. However, we're going to take a journey to France. Our first couple podcasts, we are trying to get an introduction of things to come and big things on the horizon. Our next stop on this journey is through some regions. So we've talked about some grapes, some history, some myths. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of a location. So we're going to start wide, very broad here as we go abroad. And then the closer we get to the regions, the more we'll break those up into individual episodes to really understand what they are. Because all of these regions have some huge backstories, grapes, information, just a lot going on. So we're going to start kind of broad this week. And we're going to go into France. So when we talk about French wines, pretty much kind of like the centerpiece of the wine world. I think anytime you mention wine, there's two places that almost kind of go together when you just say wine: California and France. Now, about 10, 12 years ago, France was one of the largest producers of wine, and they still are today, but Italy's kind of overtaken them as far as production numbers. But when you get into France as a region, they are, without a doubt, no holds barred, the largest producer of high quality wines, almost a ratio of 2-1 to anywhere else. They account for almost 50% of all high quality wines in the world. And high quality can mean different things for different people, but especially when you talk about the amount of money that some of the bottles that'll come out of France, they're just astronomical compared to most other wines in the world. France has been a wine region for almost 2,000 years, probably even a little bit longer than that. But as a full setup, production, retail, the whole kit and caboodle on record, about 2,000 years. Some of the top regions coming out of France: Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhone Valley, Champagne, Loire Valley, and Alsace. So we'll kind of touch on these regions as we go through this episode today, give a little bit of breakdown, but we're not going to overly get too in depth with these regions. Again, those are going to be more individual episodes. So how did French wines really become popular? Were they always known as the highest quality? Yes and no. Not right off the bat. I mean, obviously, Greeks are probably first and foremost, and then the Romans really popularized modern take on wine compared to what it was before. So really getting into viticulture, farming land. But in about 1000 AD or so, cistern monks, a lot of religious purposes behind the wines being developed comes into play. Especially, like in Burgundy, the monks, if you go to Burgundy and get to see some of these locations, the monks were going through and literally picking out these little bitty patches and would say that the soil in this little area is of such higher quality than that of it around, that it needs to be walled off, and we need to kind of like note that this is the area. So if you ever see close on a bottle, CLOS, basically all that means is a walled area, but it started way back around 1000 AD with the monks going through and trying the soil and seeing what the grapes were producing. So that's how kind of French wines really started being known as some of the high quality wines that they are. It wasn't like some areas like Italy. it was kind of no holds barred down there, and they would grow the wine and make it big productions, whatever they need to do, throw it in whatever that they had around, leather skins, whatever. They were just there to drink wine. But the French were doing all these little like nuanced kind of farming techniques to really get the most out of it from the get go. And about 1152, there is a marriage that happens between England and France, really trying to develop, some peace between the two nations in that time. But a byproduct of that, one of probably many byproducts of that marriage, was England got introduced to wines out of Bordeaux. So I will post some maps on our Instagram. So please follow all of our social accounts, Twitter, Instagram, the Duck Vine, and see some of these visuals. But on these maps, I'll post about the wine regions and where they really are located. But if you go up and look at where Bordeaux is, it sits on a river. It's got a big delta at the top of it. And straight across and on a majority of the maps, when you look at Bordeaux, you can kind of see England, just kind of sneaking in there at the top of the map. So really that made Bordeaux kind of kick off as a great shipping destination. But once that marriage happened in 1152, it instantly brought over all those wines out of Bordeaux into England. And that's how they got hooked. Started all the way back then, thankfully, with a nice little love labor that you can connect the dots there and see those French wines just kind of growing throughout England. If you've ever been to England or just look at the climate, it's a very wet country. And as we all know, too much rain does not make great wine. So they had to go elsewhere to find really good wine. Now we've had a kind of revolution in wine viticulture. So there is a lot of ways that England can get involved in today's market. But back then, it was really coming from other countries where they got hooked, and France was the biggest one. We'll talk a little bit more about Bordeaux and its river and how that really played into French wine when we get there. Still kind of going on a historical tour. We're going to jump only about 700 years or so. Talk about the French Revolution. Again, we're going very broad here. We'll get into some more depth with the history of wine in our next part 2 episode. But if you haven't heard the first one, go check it out. Really kind of talks about the very beginning of humanity as a whole and where wine started from. So, France, 1790, French Revolution's happening. Once that's kind of gotten settled down, it led to, at this point, it was really all being held by the monks, by the church, by people that had a ton of money, and not kind of where it sits like it does today. French Revolution changed that. After the French Revolution, the noble classes and the church were basically stripped of their vineyards. And then they got redistributed amongst the people. So that's how the vineyards moved from the church. And you'll hear, like, especially if you do any kind of historical research, everybody talks about the monks. Everybody talks about the church. Everybody talks about, the high class having these vineyards. Like, how did they end up at the people saying it's French Revolution? I mean, that was the whole shtick of that war, was kind of breaking up some of the high society there. And it allowed the wines to get back to the people. But the only issue with this was the people had not always been heavily involved in the vita and viniculture practices. So they kind of had to learn fast, but they were able to still gather from some people that were willing to help, some of the monks, some of the church, and still be a leader of high quality production. So 1790, turning point for the French for sure. Now, after the 1790s, we're going to jump ahead a little bit into about the mid-1800s. Phylloxera is ravaging Europe. So this really starts to kick off in about 1860. Phylloxera is a root louse. So when I say that, we're talking about a um, bug that really affects the roots of the Vitis vinifera vines that all of Europe is using. Now, how did this come around? We've talked about vineyards being around and wine being made for a couple thousand years at this point. So, how are we now affected by this root louse all of a sudden? Well, 1860. What has happened maybe in the world? Maybe a new world, perhaps? Who's to blame here? I'll let you draw your own conclusion. But as we have settled, the United States are starting to, as we know it. Of course, being from England, and we talked about that earlier in our love for fine wines, we want wines in America. Now, the issue is they try producing wines out of the United States with the local grapes, but what is not widely known at first is they are different species. So Vitis vinifera, coming out of the old world, England, France, Italy, that we've known that produces great wines. The vines in the United States, the local vines, are called Vitis Lambrusco. So totally different species, still grapes, but just different qualities of the grapes. Skins are nowhere near as thick. The juice is different. They don't produce the great wines that we knew and had come to love out of Europe. So, being as humans are in curiosity, of course, we bring vines of Vitis vinifera from France and Italy, and we plant them in the U.S., but then they take some of the local vines and bring them back to Europe. Well, American vines are immune to phylloxera. But what we didn't know at that time, because they're very small, like microscopic, kind of like bugs, when they tried to take the Vitis Lambrusco over to England, phylloxera was all over the vines. So without really knowing, American vines being brought to Europe also brought with them phylloxera. So, do you blame America for having phylloxera and having it on the vines that the French took, or do we blame the French for taking the vines even though they didn't know it had phylloxera? Who knows? Either way, turns French wine production upside down. It is ravaging everything. They almost lose all of their gross, their vineyards, their livelihoods, things that have been working for centuries, almost completely eradicated. So, it took a few years, decades for them to figure out that they could graft the Vitis vinifera vines onto American rootstock. So you could graft the European vines onto American rootstock, and then that would build up the immunity to phylloxera. So at the end of the day, the American vines that started the whole issue were also the fix. It allowed some changes in France, though, at this time, and some people were kind of grateful for it. We actually see this kind of reproduced in California as we bring over more French vines into California in the 1900s, where phylloxera hits again. And when America first started, they were just planting anything, everything, anything, wherever. And they were kind of able to reevaluate and reassess where they really wanted to put grapes. So during this time, the one highlight of phylloxera was they were really able to kind of, if they were wanting to change some things in their vineyards, I don't want this grape here, I want more of that grape, it did allow them to only help produce even higher quality wines. So you got to look for the shining light in those storms. When we travel outside of this kind of time period, where we are in kind of late 1800s, we now hit 1930. 1930 is a big um, turning point in wine terminology across the world. 1930 really starts classifications of what we know today as wines. Now, there are some other classifications we'll talk about in individual areas, but as a whole, 1930, the French start the AOC. AOC stands for Appellation d'Origine Controla. So this is an attempt in a way to really establish standards for winemaking and to try to help circumvent fraud. Going back to how high of a quality the French wines have been known for, we're hitting kind of more modern day where really fraud and thievery becomes more prevalent as we become more money hungry, as we get other luxuries in life. You know, before 1900s, it was just about surviving, right? Now we're getting a little greedy as a human race, so people really start faking wines because they do bring a heavy penny, and even in today's standards, even more so. So these sets of standards can determine what you can grow, how you can make the wine, how much of a grape it could be, how sweet, how dry. It really defines winemaking as a whole. Other countries follow throughout history, some being in different effects. The French have always been kind of the strictest on the standards over anyone else. But they really develop a roadmap here that almost every region now has something that kind of mirrors it. So now we have a good understanding of kind of some of French's broader history, how it's gotten established, what brought it from nothing to being famous, and a few other stops along the way. Let's talk about France as a whole for things like location. One of the big factors, climate. So when you get into really studying wines, and if you go for any kind of certification, part of it will be blind tasting. And when you get into the blind tasting side of things, you can use all these little clues when you're tasting the wine to really kind of help point out the region. A big part of it is climate. You can use things like how much of acidity does it have, how much alcohol does it have. All that is really majorly influenced by climate. So typically, if it's a colder area, your grape doesn't ripen up as much. You get more acidity than sugar. When there's not as much sugar, you don't get as much alcohol. So that's kind of one side of it. If you go the other side and it's much warmer, you get more sugar. So then when you start the fermentation, more sugar means more alcohol. Now, if you compare the climate of France with other areas like the United States, you can really see huge swings. But even when you look at France as a whole, you can almost kind of divide it into three major climate regions. The west side of France, where we really see the Loire Valley and Bordeaux, is where you typically see more of a temperate maritime kind of climate. If you go up to Champagne and Alsace, a little bit of Burgundy, we're talking more of a cool continental kind of climate. Then if you head down south to the Rhone Valley area, you're going to have a really warm Mediterranean climate. So one country where it's sitting gets drastically different climate swings into their weather. And this is really kind of crazy because if you look at the landmass of France, it's about the same size as Texas. And typically, when we think of Texas, I know Texas can get cold and have its weather swings, but it's pretty steady for a state and for that big of a landmass compared to what we get in the area that is covered by France. So we've talked about these three big climate areas. Now let's kind of get into some of the areas like Bordeaux. Bordeaux is the world's most successful wine region as a whole. Burgundy may be starting to challenge that, especially if you go into the Asian market. But arguably, the most important wine region for an extended period of time, and continues to kind of be the example for some of the world's most famous grapes. Even when phylloxera was hitting, we were talking earlier, of course, their livelihood is being threatened by this louse that they have no ideas about in the 1800s. So a lot of people in the Bordeaux area, being the leaders that they are, going other areas, and this is really where you see some regions like Spain and Italy get into more what we would consider now traditional methods, but it was French winemakers having to leave Bordeaux because of phylloxera. Going, if you go into Rioja, a lot of the oak aging and the way that they use cabs was brought from phylloxera and French winemakers coming there. You look at Super Tuscans, same story. It was winemakers fleeing from phylloxera and bringing Cabernet with them, and ended up in Tuscany to get these Super Tuscans. So, Bordeaux, right on the coastline of southwest France. We've talked about it. It's got this maritime climate, got the delta there. It was one of the most successful wine regions early on just because of the river that runs through it, making it super easy to get the wines exported. A lot of times when you talk about the early history of countries and their winemaking, they're limited by shipping methods, especially when you're talking about that long ago. FedEx, UPS, Amazon did not exist. So they had to use what nature gave them, and the river was a huge advantage for Bordeaux. Not only that, but it also helped maintain weather in the area, making sure that there was cool breezes to keep the vines from getting too many issues with mold and mildew. It gave them great climate, gave them enough water to be able to use in the vineyards. It has become world famous as far as the biggest grapes in the world: Cab Sauves, Merlots, Sauvignon Blancs. This is the example to be led by. You've probably heard left bank versus right bank, or, oh, I'm drinking a left bank tonight. I'm actually having one of each as I'm studying for my next exam. I'm comparing a left bank Bordeaux and a right bank Bordeaux, and it's really important when you get into studying the details of wine. Oh, what's one side of the river make a difference from the other side of the river? It's their soils, it's the rocks that are there, it's how the wind moves, but it also makes certain grapes more successful. So on the left bank, you see a lot more Cab Sauv being grown and being the major role player in blends. If you go to the right bank, it's Merlot. Merlot is the dominant grape. This has continued forever since really the monks came through. It boils down to the soil type being the biggest player there. But when you look at these wines, they're so successful, and they still use both grapes, but for different reasons to kind of round out the palates. It's very, very common out of Bordeaux to see big blends. They don't necessarily always run 100%, and they have very few grapes in the area to choose from to begin with. Talked about that AOC earlier. Defines what grapes they can use. And if you use different types of grapes, you can actually lose your chateau. Now, I say chateau because when you're in Bordeaux, the chateau is what's most important. And this came out of a classification system that happened in 1855. Now, when we talk about that, it really came around from a descendant of Napoleon, as we would all know him. and trying to figure out who was making the best wines, bringing in the biggest prices so that they could market French wines better worldwide. If you look at the rest of France, it really depends more on the location of the city versus a chateau. But as French wine is labeled in a whole, the most important thing for them is location, whether it's a city or a chateau. That area is more important to them than the grape itself. And once you study that and kind of learn, like, oh, this area is famous for this, you can learn French grapes and what they grow. So, for example, if you go into the Loire Valley and you get a Vouvray, you're gonna know it's 100% Chenin Blanc because the AOC determines by law you can only have white wine made there, and it has to be 100% Chenin Blanc. So they really kind of rely on this. Burgundy, world famous for uh, Pinot Noir. They are also heavily known for their Chardonnays. There's an area that runs through Bordeaux, the Côte d'Or, which is also known as the Golden Slope. It's really funny. There's an area right in the middle of this hillside where is the highest valued wines in the world come off of this hillside. If you go too far up the hill, it gets more rocky, more lime soily, and they don't fetch as big of a price. If you go all the way to the bottom of the slope, it gets too clayey, and again, not as much value. Well, where does this all come from? From the rain. So think about it. It makes sense. Gravity, water. You pour a bunch of water at the top of a hill, it's going to take whatever's on the top and push it all the way down to the bottom. So that middle area is like the perfect blend of soil composition that they've been practicing for thousands of years to produce the best wines out of. There's some funny pictures and stories. There's a couple of documentaries on Amazon Prime that you can go watch. But some people's job when it starts to rain in Burgundy is they go out and stand at the bottom of the hill with buckets, and as the clay is coming down off the hill, they take it back up to the hill to replace it to make sure that they still have the correct balance that they've been looking for. As we move on through France, we can look at the Rhone Valley, very famous for Viognier, Syrah, Grenache. You can talk about Côte Rôtie, Hermitage. When you get into the Rhone, it's really kind of split northern Rhone and southern Rhone. Another very popular regions for the southern Rhone, Côtes du Rhone. So Côtes means cliff. Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Tavel. Châteauneuf-du-Pape is an interesting area. I can't wait to dive into this more with you. But basically became a popular location because of the Pope. The Pope wanted to move from out of Rome and discovered this area, loved the wines from here, put up a new castle, and that's what Châteauneuf-du-Pape translates to. Then you kind of move up out of some of these hotter regions, and we end up very far north, Champagne, one of the most northerly wine regions for major production in the world. Now, when we talk about Champagne, they have three grapes there: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and of course, when we say Champagne, Champagne must be made in Champagne to be called Champagne. I feel like we've all heard that. So, very popular region to come around because of their sparkling wines. Loire Valley, we touched on, has a lot of little, like, kind of sub-regions that go into this. Especially when you start studying, Loire Valley can be one of those really tricky regions. It's almost got like 40 little tiny sub-regions in there, and a lot of them are like the same when they're neighborly. But you have this area that can grow Sauvignon Blanc. You have this that can grow Chenin Blanc. You have this area that can only make sweet whites. This area can only make dry whites. So to really get into the Loire Valley, that's going to take a couple of days of us just chatting and getting through. Now, Alsace. Alsace is a very unique region for France. Sits right on the border of Germany. Please do me a favor and follow our social media. I'm going to post a picture or two from Alsace. It's so interesting to see. It is a French town with heavy Germanic influence. The buildings, you will think I'm posting a picture of Germany. You really will. It's cute, it's quaint, has become super popular for even German wines. The climate here, very cold as well, matches those mountain productions that you'll see out of Germany. So here you're going to find a lot of Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris, some very popular grapes, as well as Pinot Noir you can find here with a different kind of take than you would see out of Burgundy. You can find some other regions in France that may not be those big hitters, like the Languedoc Roussillon. That's really coming out of southern France, Corsica. Some of these smaller regions will probably lump into one episode altogether and cover them just kind of in one big go there. But I wanted to touch on the bigger regions, kind of give you some grapes, some ideas of their climates, what they've become famous on, and a history of France to really allow us to explore France more so than just this surface level. They have so much to offer. There are specialists that literally only study Bordeaux or literally only study Burgundy because these areas get so in depth with knowledge. So I really want to give each one of these areas their own time to shine and allow us to expand on those further. I really hope you've enjoyed this podcast, this episode. Thank you for all your support. Thank you again to Winter Atlas for creating that phenomenal theme song we're all coming to know and love. Again, please follow our social media, download this podcast, tell your friends, share it. It means the world to me, and it's the way that we can continue to do this. Your support is what gets us up every day and allows us to keep creating phenomenal content for you guys to consume. I hope you guys had fun tonight. Maybe you learned a few things, but at the end of the day, we got to drink some wine. Cheers.